Hi folks, Dr. P here, and I'm going to describe, mostly from my own experience I suppose, some hazards of using a publisher for a tabletop game design as opposed to self-publishing. Now this is the way I have always approached things because it was the traditional way. Self-publishing is relatively new thanks to crowdsourcing. And now, if you're publishing a video game, it's especially easy to self-publish nowadays rather than use a publisher because a video game is all digital and can be downloaded. But self-publishing in tabletop games is much easier than in the past, thanks to digital printing, which makes a big difference, and even printing on demand, where a copy is only printed when somebody actually buys it, and to the crowdfunding like Kickstarter and GameFound. So here's a list of the things I'm going to talk about, and we can just skip over that and get to one after another. First of all, perhaps the least hazardous, is the publisher changes their mind and does not publish the game. What, you say? Well, a contract with the publisher is not a promise to publish. It's a willingness or intention to publish, and that can change and does quite often. The result is the game goes back to you unpublished, assuming you have negotiated the contract properly. If you're smart, you've set a deadline in the contract past which the game, if not published, reverts to you. If not, the publisher may hold it literally forever. Even better, if you've got a money advance against royalties, that does not go back to the publisher. So if the publisher advances you $500, let's say, even if they decide not to publish it, once the deadline is passed, then you keep the $500, but you get your game design back. Another hazard is that the publisher deliberately changes the game. Publishers often think they know better, and sometimes they do, of course. This varies with the experience of the designer and the experience of the publisher. There are also publishers who are frustrated designers, so they want to change your game for their satisfaction. Sometimes the changes are small, sometimes they're misunderstandings only, sometimes they're drastic. For example, the original Britannia was changed in a number of ways, several of which were misunderstandings. And when I made the second edition and fixed the misunderstandings and added some new stuff, I didn't change much of the rest of the game. Now, on the other hand, I remember talking to a British fellow at a convention in the UK, and he had submitted a game to Avalon Hill late in Avalon Hill's existence, and they had, by his account, thoroughly, totally bollocksed it. And he would have people write to him about it, and he sent them his rules as he wrote them, and then, according to him, people said, oh yeah, I see, now that makes sense. But Avalon Hill had screwed it up. Now, Avalon Hill was not normally in the business of screwing things up, but late in its lifetime, things got a little squirrely, and sometimes games did not go through the normal process, and weird things could happen. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of that game, sorry. Another problem is that the game can be messed up in production. The designer of a game doesn't create the production files in almost all cases. The publisher creates the production files, and they can get some things wrong, including, or maybe especially, the artist can screw up. For example, in my game Sea Kings, I submitted a separate sheet, which was a scoring sheet, and I had the low scores and even the zero as much larger boxes than later scores, because there were 3 scoring markers per player, and you could have up to 6 players. But when the artist made it, he put it on the board, and he made each box small as every other box, as though it was a standard scoring thing, and that made it a real mess. And this despite the fact that he had lots of room, he just didn't take advantage of it. In other words, I think my score sheet didn't go past 35 or 40. His went up into the 60s. So he had all that extra space, he just didn't use it. And when I pointed this out to the publishers, they said, oh no, we can't afford to have the art redone. Duh. Excuse me. Of course, the factory, which is often in China, can screw up as well. So if you're smart, you'll want to proofread what the publisher manufacturer is doing before it is printed. Nonetheless, excuse me, I remember when both the publishers and I missed a card in Sea Kings again that lacked its text. There was just no text. Fortunately, it was pretty easy to figure out what it should have said. There can be rule changes that are annoying, to say the least, and potentially can screw up the game. To go back to Britannia, the original that H.P. Gibson's published, and it was carried over into the Avalon Hill version, Raiders was supposed to be something that was confined to particular turns, so that once those turns had passed, the Raiders had to land in Britain. But the uncredited developer of the game misunderstood and thought the Raiders were a separate kind of army and allowed them to float, as I called it, out in the ocean indefinitely, centuries after those people no longer were raiders and didn't even live in their homeland anymore. They only lived in Britain. Now, the game was quite robust, so it survived that, and some people actually prefer that, but it doesn't make any sense historically at all. Now, in the second edition of Britannia, there was a long delay to get the game ready, and then suddenly it had to be made ready in a week or two. That's scheduling on the part of Fantasy Flight. And they chose to rewrite the rules in sequence of play format. I had written them in reference format. Well, these were written by somebody who may or may not have played the game, but given the time available, it's certainly not the case that they were play tested. In other words, some hubris occurred here. Fantasy Flight felt that they were so good that they could rewrite rules and not have to test them, and that's dumb. Well, I was very busy at the time, so I read them and found a lot of problems, but I didn't find them all. And when I suggested I should send those rules to some people who knew the Britannia rules better than I did, because there are people like that, they didn't respond, and so I didn't. And that meant that after the game was published, we had to publish a page or two of errata because the rules were screwed up. Now, another example of changes, which are not rule changes, in the plastic figure edition of Britannia, which was done by PSC Games in the United Kingdom, the colors and the sculpts were messed up. 2 of the 4 sculpts, in other words, the shape of the plastic figures, were too similar, despite my warnings about it. And 2 colors were so much alike, especially in low light, that it was hard to tell them apart, which combined with the sculpt problem was a big problem. Evidently, they wanted to avoid using yellow or orange because it was unmilitary. I don't know, but the result was a bad interface. Now, even worse, the publisher can fail to pay the designer. In Dragon Rage, the original edition, 1982, 10,000 copies were printed, but all I got were some free games. Why was that? Well, the parent miniatures company of the board game company failed. The board game company was doing fine. I was later told that the owner, who was Duke Seafried, who to this day is a famous miniatures guy, got into a disagreement with his banker, and the banker called in the loan. And when the banker called in the loan, the company died. In the Britannia case, again, the plastic piece version, 2020, I'd known the people for years, and I received a substantial advance, thousands of dollars, but I am owed 5 figures to this day. They just won't pay. And since they're in Britain and I'm in the United States, I have very little option. You know, if you try to hire a lawyer, the lawyer would eat up all of that money fairly quickly. The best you can say is you might get a tax improvement out of it because you could write off the money you don't get paid as a loss. I haven't done that yet, but that's probably what I'll have to do. Could there be something worse than that? Well, yes. One designer sold a game to a publisher, but unwisely did not include a reversion clause. The publisher didn't publish it, but wanted a very large sum to return the rights to the designer. That got sorted out one way or another, but it was a failure of a novice designer who should not have been a novice, but we won't go into that, that he didn't negotiate a proper contract. Another designer had his board game converted to digital play. It was provided as a free-to-play game to help recruit people to the publisher's website. But as there was no income from that game, the designer received no royalty for use of his game. And there was no tax break there either, because legitimately, I guess you could say, there was no royalty. Now, as I don't yet self-publish, I'm not going to compare with using a publisher, but it's a very different world and requires the designer to become a business person to self-publish. And the question is, do you want to be a designer or do you want to be a business person? Sorry about the coughs. Thanks for listening.